Athletes Audio Academy. I put this together to give athletes a resource, a one-stop shop where they can go, maybe not to get the entire story on how to get their mental game together, but some great resources from outstanding pros in the field like Dr. Jim Taylor. You may have seen him on YouTube. You may have seen him in Psychology Today. Soon you will see him in another academic setting. Jim, great to see you. How are you?
Great to see you again, Bob. Glad to be here.
Talk a little bit about your newly discovered or rediscovered academic setting, and then we'll talk a little bit about our topic for today, which is maintaining the right level of intensity for sport. Not too much, not too little, but give us a little background and talk about your new or returning role to academia.
Sure. I've just recently accepted a faculty position in the Sport and Performance Psychology program, master's program at the University of Denver. For the coming year, I'll be commuting every other week and working with master's and doctoral students in sport and performance psychology.
Wow, cool. So is this, and I say return, is this a return to the education space for you, or is it a new venture?
Not entirely. Early in my career, I was a full-time faculty member at a university in Florida, but for a number of years, I've been an adjunct professor at University of San Francisco. So I've always kept my hand in teaching. I love academia. I love educating young people. So it's just a little more in-depth involvement, return to academia.
Well, if you're enrolled in those programs at Denver, you couldn't have a better, more knowledgeable professor about to join your ranks. So make sure you sign into those classes quickly. One of the topics that inevitably you'll cover in your coursework as you study your PhD or master's in sports psychology is about intensity. You know, I think we see it in sports when, you know, the guy makes the shot and, he's fired up and pumped up. And you see even the images of like the athletes in the locker room before the game with the music cranked up real loud and just getting themselves psyched up and in the game. But there's actually too much intensity that someone could bring to bear to actually perform well. So talk a little bit about maintaining that optimal level of intensity. What is the optimal level? How do you know when it's too much? How do you know when it's not enough? That an athlete might use to better moderate or keep themselves in check while they're playing?
Sure. A couple things about intensity to preface all that. First of all, in the field of sports psychology, the word intensity is not actually used very often. Most often the term anxiety is used. And I don't like the word anxiety because it has negative connotations. Nobody wants to feel anxiety. But when I talk about intensity, everybody wants a degree of intensity. Mm-hmm. And when I speak of intensity, I think of a continuum. At one end of the line of intensity is very low intensity, such as sleep. The other end of the continuum is very high intensity, such as sheer terror. And somewhere between low intensity sleep and high intensity terror, athletes perform their best. Now, there are two components that go into it. First of all, some athletes just perform their best at different levels of intensity. Just they're wired a certain way. Some perform best fairly relaxed. Some sort of moderately intense, kind of fired up, but not too fired up. And others perform best banging their head against the wall, really fired up. Mm-hmm. The sport also plays a role. There are some sports that have certain intensity requirements. For example, powerlifting, an offensive lineman in football, that requires very high intensity because it involves high explosiveness and relatively low skill. At the other end of the continuum is very low intensity sports, such as running, rifle shooting, archery. Golf is obviously a classic example where athletes have to be extremely relaxed in order to perform well. Those sports tend to be more technical. And then there are some sports in the middle, basketball, soccer, where some of the technical sport positions in football, where they need a degree of intensity, but not too much, because too much intensity tends to corrupt motor coordination.
And what I was going to let me ask a question there. But it's not necessarily an absolute. Like the individual athlete who's a lineman may or may not need to be super fired up to play their sport well. Granted, across the averages, that's probably true. But a question that pops into my mind is what cues or keys should the athlete look for in themselves to notice whether or not that level of intensity is right for them?
Well, first of all, do they feel like they generally perform well at a certain level of intensity? One thing that I found interesting in working with athletes is that I often have athletes experiment with their intensity in practice. So let's say I have an athlete who is generally in the middle range of intensity and they think they perform best there. I'll have them experiment with being really relaxed for a while in practice and then being really intense. And so very often athletes they fall back on what they're sort of comfortable with and they're familiar with, but that is not always what's best for their performance. And when they experiment with different levels of performance, different levels of intensity, they start to see, oh my gosh, when I get more intense, I actually perform better. Or in some cases, when I calm down more, I perform better. And as a general rule, that is one way to figure out ideal intensity. The other is to simply have athletes look back on recent performances and look at, say performances where they've been successful and ask, how did they feel physiologically? What was their mindset? How did their body feel? And then to think back recent performances where they didn't perform well. And again, how did their body feel? What were their emotions? What was their mindset? And typically, you're going to see a pretty clear pattern between when athletes perform well and a certain level of intensity and when athletes perform poorly and that level of intensity.
So what, for that athlete who's watching our interview and doesn't have the benefit of having you stand on the side of the court at practice with them, if you're helping that athlete raise their intensity as in the experimental way that you described, or lower it just to see how the other half or the other third lives, see how they feel best, what are some things you might suggest that an athlete try to up their intensity so they can experience that, and then to down their intensity to experience that in practice?
Okay, the nice thing about intensity, it's all very practical and behavioral for the most part. And so it's fairly easy to implement some of these strategies. Let's talk about an athlete who wants to increase intensity. I call these psych up techniques. And some of the basic ones, the most fundamental one is move. That if athletes want to increase their intensity, because intensity is fundamentally the amount of physiological activity they have in their body. So simply moving, jumping around, getting their body going will increase their intensity. Another technique is just breathing. Breathing is a really powerful tool that not enough athletes spend time with because it can affect so many things physiologically and psychologically. So if you want to increase intensity, you're not going to be going like this. You're going to be going... Another strategy is high energy self-talk. Come on, let's go, keep at it, let's go. And I don't know how much you can see me on camera, but when I do that, I'm not just sitting there with my body relaxed when I say, come on, let's go. I'm pumping my fists, I'm getting myself going. So the self-talk just automatically brings in physical intensity with your body. Another great tool to use before practice and before competitions is music. You see so many world-class and professional athletes before games and events and meets listening to music. And a lot of them are listening to high-intensity music, rock and roll, hip-hop, that just gets them fired up. Because music is an incredibly powerful experience. It affects people physically, emotionally, psychologically. So that's a great tool for amping themselves up.
And similarly, if I'm to extrapolate from what you're saying, to lower the level of intensity that you might want to experience, breathe slower. Don't have a bunch of these, moves like that. Don't jump up and down. Close your eyes. You know what I mean? That the physical, the mind-body connection is such that if your body's relaxed, if your body's quiet, it's really hard for your mind to be active. So to just do the opposite, in fact, of what you're saying, and calm down your movements, calm down your breathing. Is that, I don't want to put words in your mouth, is that close?
No, that's exactly right, and I call those psych down techniques when you have an athlete who might be nervous before a competition and they need to calm themselves down. So slowing their body down, slowing their pace, long, slow, deep breaths, relaxing music. Here's a good one: don't hang out with high-intensity people. And this is actually a very good lesson for coaches in the locker room, because you suggested this idea that this sort of classic, let's say, pre-football game routine with a lot of football players is to be banging their heads against each other with their helmets on, of course, listening to pounding music, getting themselves really psyched up. But the problem with that assumption is that again assumes that everybody needs their intensity high. And one thing I encourage for coaches of teams is have an area in the locker room or the area where they're preparing where some of the athletes who need to calm down can go off and listen to quiet music and be around calm people and just chill out.
Even to give the coach the opportunity to have that conversation at the beginning of the year, or as the team is selected, it's like, okay, you player X, how do you feel most? How do you get how do we get the best out of you? Okay, if you need to be calm, there's going to be a spot over here in the locker room pregame for you to go do that and for you to quiet your mind and so on. I can envision all the hockey goaltenders I ever played with finding a really quiet place, most likely out in the hallway, not even in the locker room, but laying down on the floor on their back with their pads on and, and doing imagery to calm down, relaxation and imagery to calm down and to picture themselves making the save, blocker side or whatever. So whatever that individual athlete needs, the coach needs to be able to provide a space for that to happen.
Right, and a couple of key things there is that coaches, as you suggest, do need to learn about their athletes. And I encourage coaches to keep a file of what their athletes' needs are before a competition. Because if a coach knows what they need to, let's say a coach knows that one athlete needs to calm down, well, they're not going to go give them a pep talk. And speaking of that, the classic pregame pep talk is one of the worst techniques for coaches to use. Because the idea behind a pep talk in general is to fire the team up, to get them excited to go out on the field. Now that'll work for about 1/3 of the athletes who are maybe a little under intense, and the pep talk gets them to good intensity. But then there's the group that's at good intensity, and that gets them to too much intensity. And then the group that's already at high intensity, that puts them way over the top.
Right.
And so it's much better to use an individual approach when it comes to some sort of motivational or pep talk before a competition.
And those athletes who are already at a super high level of intensity, when you say over the top, that means they're so pumped up on adrenaline that they're not able to perform by the time they get out there on the field.
Right, exactly. They're going to be the ones who are freaking out, and they're the ones who you need to just keep them within the reasonable range.
Yeah, so folks, if you think this is good, you should read some of Dr. Jim Taylor. He's a very prolific writer as well as professor and blogger. Where can we find some more information about you, Dr. Taylor? And I know you're passionate about technology use with children. I know you're passionate about sport performance, but where can we get more information about what's inside your brain?
Sure. You can go to my website. It's drjimtaylor.com, one word, drjimtaylor.com. I've got tons of articles, newsletters, blogs that I've written that are free. Also, people can go to my website and sign up for my newsletters, Prime Sport Alert. And every other month, it's a bi-monthly e-newsletter that I send out. It's free, where I pick one topic related to sports performance, the psychology of sports performance, and just write about it. Very focused, very easy to read. And so if you go to my website, you can pretty much read almost everything I've ever written. Plus, I have a bunch of books on the psychology of sport. Probably the most general one that would apply to most people is Prime Sport, Triumph of the Athlete Mind. It's pretty much everything I know about the mental side of sport that applies across all sports.
Well, I can't thank you enough for your insight into intensity and for all the work that you're doing to help athletes get better and get their minds right. Dr. Jim Taylor on the Athletes Audio Academy. Thanks a lot, Jim.
Very fun always, Bob. Good to talk to you.